A $480 million decision, and not one man in the room could solve it. The number glowed cold on the screen as Ethan Cole leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight, his patience thinner than the crystal glass in his hand. The board sat around him in silence. 5 executives, decades of experience, Ivy League degrees, and still nothing. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan shimmered in late evening light. But inside the private dining room, the air felt heavy, stuck, like time itself had. Paused, Ethan exhaled sharply, tapping the tablet again. "We've been over this for 2 hours," he said, voice low but cutting. "How is this still unresolved?" No one answered. One man adjusted his tie. Another stared at spreadsheets as if the numbers might rearrange themselves under pressure, but they didn't. They never did. And across the room, unnoticed, Clara Whitmore moved quietly between tables. Her black uniform simple, her steps precise, a tray balanced effortlessly in one hand. She didn't belong in their world. At least that's what everyone assumed. Just another waitress blending into the background, invisible by design. But her eyes lingered, not on faces, but on patterns, numbers, fragments of conversation drifting through the air like pieces of a puzzle no one else realized they were dropping. "The risk exposure is too high," one board member muttered. "Only if you're looking at it quarterly," another replied, tension rising again. The same argument, the same loop. Ethan's fingers tightened around his glass, irritation flickering across his face. "We're not here to guess," he snapped. "We're here to decide." But still, nothing. Just hesitation dressed up as caution. Clara stepped closer, setting down a glass of water beside an untouched plate, her movement smooth, almost silent, but her gaze flicked once to the tablet. Just a second, just enough. And something shifted behind her calm expression, something sharp, precise, recognition. She turned to leave, but paused, not because she wanted to be seen, but because she couldn't unsee it now. The flaw was there, obvious once you knew where to look, hidden in plain sight. The kind of mistake that didn't come from lack of intelligence, but from assumption. And behind her, Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered, louder this time. "Maybe we should ask the waitress." A few weak smiles appeared around the table. Not because it was funny, but because no one wanted to be the one without an answer. Clara stopped, her back still turned, her hand resting lightly against the tray. She didn't react, didn't flinch, but something in the room shifted anyway. Like the moment before a storm when the air goes still, she turned slowly, calm, composed, her voice quiet, almost gentle. "You're not losing money," she said, and for the first time that night, every single person looked up. "You're misreading time." No one spoke at first, not because they did not understand what she said, but because they understood it too well, the kind of silence that does not come from confusion, but from recognition. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly as he leaned forward, studying her for the first time, as if she had just appeared in the room instead of serving in it all evening. "Explain that," he said, his voice quieter now, controlled, but no longer dismissive. Clara did not move closer. She did not need to. Her presence had already shifted the gravity of the room. Her gaze flicked once to the tablet still glowing on the table. "Your model assumes immediate capital deployment," she said calmly, each word measured. "But the market you are entering does not respond in quarters, it responds in cycles." One of the board members frowned, glancing back at the numbers. "We accounted for timing," he said defensively, but his voice lacked conviction. Clara shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in precision. "You accounted for speed, not timing. Those are not the same," she continued, her tone steady, almost gentle. "You are forcing a 12-month expectation on a 36-month behavior pattern. So your projections are not wrong. They are early." The words settled into the room like something heavy and undeniable. Another executive leaned forward, scrolling through the data again, faster now, more urgently. "If that is true," he muttered, then stopped, because he already knew. Ethan did not interrupt, did not look away. His attention locked on her, as if every other variable in the room had disappeared. "And what happens if we adjust?" he asked. And this time, there was no sarcasm in his voice. Clara answered without hesitation. "You do not lose $480 million, she said. You delay profit by 18 months and increase total return by at least 20%. A breath caught somewhere across the table, subtle, but audible, the kind of reaction no one intended to show, because it meant they had missed it, all of them. Ethan's fingers slowly released the tension around his glass, his mind already running the recalculation, faster than any spreadsheet could display, and it aligned. Perfectly. Too perfectly. That is, one board member began, then stopped. Because there was nothing to argue with, no flaw to expose, just clarity, clean and undeniable. Ethan sat back slightly. But this time it was not from frustration. It was from something else, something closer to respect, or maybe disbelief. Who taught you that? He asked, not as a challenge, but as a question that mattered. Clara met his gaze briefly, her expression unchanged. No one, she said softly. I just learned what happens when numbers are treated like people. They stop behaving the way you expect. The room fell quiet again, but this silence was different. It was not heavy. It was focused, as if every person there was recalibrating not just the deal, but their understanding of who had just spoken. Ethan exhaled slowly, then glanced around the table, and for the first time that night, no one looked back at him for direction. They were all looking at her, and in that moment, something subtle but irreversible shifted, not in the numbers, but in the balance of power. Ethan did not look at the screen anymore. He was looking at her, as if the numbers had become secondary to the person who had just rewritten them. Say that again, he said quietly, not because he did not hear her, but because he wanted to understand how someone standing in a service uniform had just outperformed an entire executive board. Clara did not repeat herself. She simply stepped closer to the table, just enough to reach the tablet, her movement calm, uninvited, yet no one stopped her. She turned the screen slightly, her finger tracing a line across the projection. Your capital enters here, she said. But your market response does not begin until here. She paused, letting the gap speak for itself. You are measuring success before the system has time to respond. One of the board members leaned in, his eyes scanning the timeline, slower now, more carefully. We assumed early traction would validate the model, he said, but even as he spoke, the doubt was already there. Clara nodded once, not dismissing him, but refining the thought. It would, if you were dealing with a consumer market, she replied. But you are not. You are entering infrastructure, behavior changes slower, decisions compound over time, not instantly. The room absorbed her words in silence, the kind of silence that follows clarity, not confusion. Ethan stood up slowly, not abruptly, but with intention, his chair sliding back just an inch, enough to mark the shift. Run the numbers again, he said to the board, but his eyes never left Clara. Fingers moved across screens, calculations updated, projections shifted, and within seconds, the model told a different story. The loss disappeared, replaced by delayed growth, stronger margins, a longer horizon. Exactly as she had said. One man exhaled under his breath, another leaned back, stunned, not by the outcome, but by how easily they had missed it. Ethan finally looked at the screen, then back at her, and something in his expression changed, not dramatically, but undeniably. The sharp edge of superiority softened into something more measured, more aware. You saw that in seconds, he said, not asking, but confirming. Clara stepped back slightly, returning to the space she had occupied before, as if the moment did not belong to her. It was already there, she said. You just did not look long enough. A faint crease appeared between Ethan's brows, not from frustration, but from thought. No, he said quietly. We looked, we just did not see. The distinction lingered in the air, subtle, but important. He took a step closer to her now, closing the distance that had once defined their roles. What is your name? He asked, and for the first time, the question carried weight. Clara met his gaze, steady, unshaken. Clara Whitmore, she answered. Simple, direct. Ethan nodded once, as if committing it to memory, then glanced briefly at the board, who were still staring at the updated projections, still recalculating more than just numbers. Clara, he repeated, then paused, not searching for words, but choosing them carefully. You are not just a waitress, are you? The question was quiet, but it held something new, something that had not been there before. Respect. Clara did not smile, did not deny it. She simply picked up the empty glass from the table, her voice calm, unchanged. No one is ever just one thing, she said. And as she turned to walk away, leaving behind a room full of people who suddenly understood less about their own assumptions than they had an hour ago, Ethan remained standing, watching her go, realizing that the most valuable insight of the night had not come from data, but from the person they had almost ignored. The door to the private dining room closed softly behind Clara, but the silence she left behind did not fade. It deepened. Ethan remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes still fixed on the space where she had been, as if something important had just walked out and taken the answers with it. One of the board members cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. "We should finalize the adjustment," he said, his voice more careful now, less certain of its authority. Ethan did not respond immediately. He slowly sat back down, but the posture was different, less rigid, more aware. He glanced at the updated projection again. The numbers now aligned, clean, logical, undeniable, but instead of satisfaction, there was something else behind his expression, something quieter, something unsettled. "Run the long-term scenario," he said, his tone steady, but no longer sharp. Fingers moved again across screens, recalculations layered over recalculations, each one reinforcing what had already been revealed. The decision that had seemed impossible an hour ago now looked obvious, almost embarrassingly so. "It holds," another executive said quietly. "Better than our original model." No one celebrated, no one smiled. Because the victory did not feel like theirs, Ethan leaned back slightly, exhaling, his gaze drifting toward the closed door again. "We missed something simple," he said, more to himself than to the room. "No," one of the older board members replied after a pause. "We ignored where it could come from." The distinction landed heavier than any financial loss. Ethan nodded once, slowly, then stood again, this time with purpose. "Continue without me," he said, already reaching for his jacket. A few surprised looks followed him, but no one questioned it. Not anymore. He stepped out into the hallway, the ambient noise of the restaurant returning, soft conversations, clinking glasses, the quiet rhythm of service, and there she was, moving between tables, with the same calm precision, as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just shifted a decision. Worth nearly $500 million. Ethan watched her for a moment, noticing details he had ignored before, the way she observed before she acted, the way she listened without appearing to, the way she carried herself with a quiet certainty that did not need validation. He stepped forward, closing the distance. "Clara," he said, and this time, her name did not sound like an afterthought. She turned, meeting his gaze with the same steady composure. "Yes, sir," she replied, professional, unchanged. But something in the air between them had shifted. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of doubt, but out of recognition that this moment required something different than what he was used to. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words simple, but deliberate. Clara did not react immediately. She simply waited, allowing the moment to unfold without rushing it. Ethan continued. "What I said earlier, it was dismissive, and it was wrong." The admission hung there, quiet, unforced. Clara studied him for a brief second, not judging, just observing, then gave a small nod. "People say things they do not mean when they are under pressure," she said softly, not excusing, but not condemning either. Ethan almost smiled, but did not, because he understood that this was not about being forgiven, it was about understanding. "You saw what none of us did," he said. "That is not something I can ignore." Clara adjusted the tray in her hand, her posture still composed. "You could have," she replied. "Most people do." Ethan held her gaze, and for the first time that night, there was no trace of hierarchy left in it, only clarity. "I am not most people," he said quietly, and something in his tone suggested that he was not just stating a fact, he was making a decision. Clara did not move right away, not because she was unsure, but because she understood something Ethan was only beginning to realize, that this moment was not about opportunity, it was about intent. She held his gaze for a second longer, then shifted her attention back to the dining room, placing a fresh glass on a nearby table with the same steady precision. "Then do not ignore it," she said quietly. As if the answer had always been that simple. Ethan followed her movement, not interrupting, not pushing. For once he was not trying to control the outcome. He was trying to understand it. "Come work for me," he said finally, the words direct, but stripped of the usual authority they would have carried. Clara paused, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, not surprised, not impressed, just thoughtful. She turned back to him slowly, her expression unchanged. "You do not even know me," she replied, her tone calm, but not dismissive. Ethan nodded once, accepting that. "I know what I saw," he said, "and I know what my entire board missed." Clara considered that for a moment, not weighing the offer, but weighing the assumption behind it. "And that is enough for you?" she asked, not challenging, just clarifying. Ethan hesitated, just briefly, then answered honestly. "It is enough for me to ask." The honesty in that answer landed differently than anything he had said before. There was no pressure in it, no expectation, just a door left open. Clara looked at him, really looked this time, not as a customer, not as a CEO, but as a person trying, perhaps for the first time in a long time, to step outside his own certainty. "And if I say no?" she asked softly. Ethan exhaled, not frustrated, not impatient, just aware. "Then I will still walk back into that room," he said, "and make a decision based on what you showed us." He paused, then added, "And I will remember where it came from." Something shifted in Clara's expression, not visible enough to name, but present, a recognition, perhaps, or a quiet respect returning the one he had just offered. She picked up her tray again, grounding herself in the role she still occupied. "Most people would not say that," she said. Ethan almost smiled this time, but it was smaller, more real. "I am learning that most people miss important things," he replied. Clara let out a soft breath, not quite a laugh, but close, then glanced toward the private room where the board continued their discussion, the weight of the decision still unfolding. "Without her, you already have everything you need in that room," she said. "You just needed to see it differently." Ethan nodded, understanding now that her value was not just in answers, but in perspective, something far more difficult to replace. "And you?" he said. "Where did you learn to see it like that?" The question lingered, not intrusive, but genuine. Clara was quiet for a moment, her eyes drifting briefly to the window where the city lights reflected back in fractured patterns. Then she looked back at him, steady as ever. "From losing things when I trusted the wrong numbers," she said, her voice soft, but carrying a depth that suggested a story far beyond what she was willing to share. Ethan did not ask more. He understood the boundary without needing it explained, and in that restraint, something unspoken formed between them, not an agreement, not yet, but the beginning of something built not on position, but on recognition. And as Clara turned to continue her work, Ethan remained where he stood, realizing that for the first time in years, the most important decision in front of him was not on the screen. It was walking away in a black uniform, carrying a tray, and choosing whether or not to be seen. Ethan did not follow her this time, not because he lost interest, but because he understood something had to shift inside him before anything could shift between them. He turned slowly and walked back toward the private room, the sound of conversation growing clearer as he approached. Numbers, projections, cautious optimism. But when he opened the door, the room fell quiet again, not out of confusion this time, but expectation. They were waiting for him, for his decision, for his authority to seal what had already been proven. Ethan stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. His gaze moved across the table, not searching for answers anymore, but measuring something else entirely. "We proceed," he said simply, and no one questioned it. Not because he was the CEO, but because the logic now stood on its own, clean, undeniable. One of the board members nodded, already making notes. Another adjusted the timeline, aligning it with the corrected model. The deal that had once been uncertain now moved forward with quiet confidence. But Ethan did not sit right away. He remained standing at the head of the table, his hand resting lightly against the back of his chair. "There is something else," he added, and the room stilled again, subtle, attentive. "We missed something tonight," he continued, his tone steady, but stripped of any trace of ego. "Not in the data, in our thinking." A few glances were exchanged, not defensive, but reflective, because they knew it was true. We assumed expertise only comes from certain places, Ethan said, certain titles, certain rooms, certain resumes. He paused, letting the weight of that settle. And because of that, we almost made the wrong decision. No one interrupted, no one disagreed, because the evidence had already spoken louder than any argument could. Ethan finally sat down, but the position no longer felt like control. It felt like responsibility. That cannot happen again, he said, quieter now, but more certain than before. One of the senior members leaned forward slightly. Are you suggesting we expand the advisory process? He asked, careful with his words. Ethan shook his head once. I am suggesting we expand how we listen, he replied, and the distinction lingered, subtle, but significant. Another silence followed. But this one carried a different kind of clarity, as if the room itself had shifted perspective, not just on the deal, but on something deeper, something structural. Ethan's gaze drifted briefly to the door again, just for a moment, then back to the table. Finalize the model, he said. Adjust the timeline to 36 months, and update the projections accordingly. Fingers moved again, efficient, precise, but now guided by a different understanding. The meeting continued, but the energy had changed, less tension, more alignment, less assumption, more awareness. And yet, even as the numbers fell into place, Ethan's thoughts moved elsewhere, not to the outcome, but to the moment that had created it, the quiet voice, the simple correction, the perspective that had shifted everything. And when the meeting finally concluded, when decisions were confirmed and documents prepared, Ethan stood once more, gathering his jacket. But this time, there was no hesitation in his movement, no uncertainty in his direction. He stepped out into the hallway again, the rhythm of the restaurant unchanged, but his perception of it entirely different. He scanned the room briefly, then found her, exactly where she had been before, moving through the space with the same calm precision, as if nothing about her had changed, even though everything around her had. Ethan walked toward her again, not as a CO approaching a waitress, but as someone who had finally learned where to look. And this time, when he spoke her name, it carried something new, not authority, not curiosity, but intent. Clara, Ethan said. Again, but this time he did not stop at her side. He stepped fully into her space, not intruding, but present, as if he had finally decided not to let the moment pass. She turned toward him, her expression the same calm surface, but her eyes sharper now, aware that something had changed, not just in him, but in what he was about to ask. We approved the deal, he said, his voice steady, but quieter than before. Not announcing, just informing. Clara gave a small nod, not surprised. Then you saw it clearly, she replied, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. Ethan watched her for a second, noticing how she did not ask for credit, did not wait for acknowledgement, as if the result itself was enough. We saw it because you pointed it out, he said, and this time, there was no hesitation in giving that truth its place. Clara shifted the tray in her hand, grounding herself again. You chose to listen, she answered. That matters more. The words settled between them, simple, but precise. Ethan exhaled softly, then reached into his jacket, pulling out a card, not with the casual confidence he was used to, but with intention. He held it out, not pushing it toward her, just offering it. This is my direct line, he said. Not my office, not my assistant me. Clara looked at the card, then back at him, her expression unreadable, not impressed, not dismissive, just measuring. You are persistent, she said, not accusing, just observing. Ethan allowed a small smile this time, brief, honest, only when something is worth it, he replied. Clara studied him for a moment longer, as if deciding whether those words belonged to the same man who had laughed earlier that evening. The contrast was there, clear, but she did not point it out. She simply reached out and took the card, her fingers brushing it lightly, not holding on longer than necessary. And what exactly do you think this is? She asked, lifting the card slightly, not as a challenge, but as a question that deserved clarity. Ethan met her gaze without looking away. An opportunity, he said, then paused, correcting himself. No, an invitation. The distinction was subtle, but intentional. Clara's eyes flickered slightly, catching it, understanding it. She glanced down at the card once more, then slipped it into the small pocket of her apron. Not as acceptance, not as rejection, just acknowledgement. Invitations can be ignored, she said softly. Ethan nodded, accepting that without resistance. Then I will have to earn your attention, he replied, and there was no arrogance in it. Only a quiet certainty that effort, not status, would define what came next. Clara looked at him for a long second, the noise of the restaurant fading into the background, not because it disappeared, but because something more important had taken its place. Most people think effort is about proving themselves, she said, her voice low, almost reflective. But it is usually about unlearning what they believe gives them power. Ethan did not respond immediately, because he understood that this was not advice. It was a boundary, a standard, one he had not yet met, but now recognized. Then I have something to learn, he said finally. Clara gave a small nod, not encouraging, not dismissing, just acknowledging the truth in that statement. Then she stepped back, returning to her rhythm, to the movement of the room, as if the moment had already passed for her. But for Ethan, it had just begun, and as he stood there, watching her disappear once more into the quiet flow of the restaurant, he realized that for the first time in years, the next move was not about control, it was about becoming someone worth listening to. The night moved on, but something invisible had shifted in the rhythm of the room. Clara continued her work with the same quiet precision, but now, eyes followed her longer, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition that something they did not understand had just passed through their world and left it different. She did not acknowledge it. She never did. She moved table to table, refilling glasses, clearing plates, listening without appearing to, her presence steady, grounded, untouched by the weight others were beginning to place on her. Across the room, Ethan remained where he stood for a moment longer than usual, not because he did not know where to go, but because he was recalibrating something deeper than direction. Then finally he turned, stepping out of the restaurant and into the cool night air. The city stretched out before him, lights reflecting off glass and steel, constant, predictable, controlled. The kind of environment he had built his life mastering. But tonight felt different, not because the city had changed, but because he had seen something that did not fit into any system he knew how to control. He walked slowly toward the curb where his car waited, his driver stepping forward immediately, opening the door, but Ethan paused, his hand resting briefly on the frame, his mind not on schedules or meetings or the decision they had just finalized, but on a quiet voice that had rewritten everything with a single sentence. He slid into the back seat, the door closing softly behind him, the car pulling away into the flow of traffic, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan did not reach for his phone. He sat still, watching the city pass by, replaying the moment again and again, not searching for the answer anymore, but trying to understand the person behind it. Clara Whitmore, he said quietly to himself, as if the name carried more weight now than any title he had heard that day. Across town, the restaurant began to empty, the late evening slowing into its final rhythm. Clara moved into the back area, setting down her tray, rolling her shoulders slightly, not from exhaustion, but from routine. Another shift, another night. Nothing unusual, at least on the surface. One of the other servers approached her, eyes still wide with something like disbelief. "What did you even say in there?" she whispered, half curious, half amazed. Clara gave a small shrug, reaching for a clean towel. "Just what they needed to hear," she replied simply, as if there was nothing more to it. The other server shook her head slightly, smiling, but not fully understanding. "You know that guy," she added. "That was Ethan Cole." Clara nodded once, not impressed, not dismissive, just acknowledging the fact. "I know who he is," she said, her tone even. The server hesitated, then asked, "And you just talked to him like that?" Clara paused for a moment, then looked up, her expression calm, grounded. "I talked to the problem," she said. And something in that answer lingered, something that did not depend on status or power or recognition, just clarity. Back in the car, Ethan leaned his head slightly against the seat, the city lights flickering across his face, and for the first time in years, the next step in his life was not already mapped out, not already calculated, not already controlled. It was uncertain, undefined, and strangely necessary, Because somewhere between a dismissed voice and a corrected future, he had encountered something he could not ignore, and this time, he was not going to look away. The next morning did not announce itself with anything dramatic. No sudden realization, no urgent message, just the quiet persistence of routine. But for Ethan, routine no longer felt the same. His office overlooked the city from 40 floors above, glass walls, clean lines, everything in its place, controlled, predictable. But his attention was not on the skyline or the reports waiting on his desk. It was on a single name written at the top of a blank page, Clara Whitmore. He stared at it for a moment, not because he needed to remember it, but because he was trying to understand why it stayed with him. A soft knock broke the stillness. His assistant stepped in, holding a tablet. "Your 9 o'clock is here," she said, efficient as always. Ethan nodded, but did not look away from the name. "Reschedule," he replied, his tone calm, but final. The assistant hesitated, just briefly, surprised. "It is the Carson Group," she added carefully. Ethan finally looked up, his expression steady. "Reschedule," he repeated, and that was enough. The door closed quietly, leaving him alone again. But this time, the silence felt intentional, not empty. He reached for his phone, not out of habit, but with purpose, his thumb hovering over the contact list, then stopping. He did not have her number, only the card he had given, and the realization settled in, subtle, but clear, for once. He was not the one in control of the next move. Across the city, the restaurant prepared for another day, the early light filtering through tall windows, casting soft reflections across polished tables. Clara moved through the space before opening hours, setting silverware, aligning glasses, her movements the same as always, steady, precise. But something lingered just beneath the surface, not distraction, not expectation, just awareness. She reached into her apron pocket for a moment, her fingers brushing against the edge of the card, then paused, not pulling it out, not looking at it, just acknowledging that it was there. She withdrew her hand, continuing her work without interruption. The morning progressed. Customers arrived. Conversations filled the room. Orders were taken. Plates were served. And yet, every so often, her thoughts drifted back, not to the man himself, but to the moment, the shift, the way a single perspective had changed everything, and more importantly, the way he had responded afterward, not with control, but with restraint. Back in his office, Ethan leaned back in his chair, the city stretching out beyond him, but his focus still inward. He picked up a pen, tapping it once against the desk, then setting it down again, the decision forming. Slowly, not impulsive, but deliberate, he reached for his phone again, this time opening a different contact. "Find out everything you can about Clara Whitmore," he said, his voice calm, controlled. But there was something different beneath it now, not suspicion, not strategy, but curiosity grounded in respect. The voice on the other end responded immediately, efficient, unquestioning. Understood. The call ended, and Ethan placed the phone back on the desk, but instead of feeling closer to an answer, he felt something else, something unexpected, hesitation. He looked at the name on the page again, then closed the notebook slowly, as if recognizing that not everything worth knowing could be uncovered that way. Across town, Clara paused for just a second as she placed a cup of coffee in front of a customer, her movements still smooth, uninterrupted, but her eyes flickered briefly toward the window, the city beyond, vast, complex, full of decisions being made in rooms she had never entered. And yet, somehow, she had already changed one of them. And as the day continued, both of them moved forward, one searching, the other simply continuing, but neither of them quite the same as they had been before. The information arrived faster than Ethan expected, not because it was easy to find, but because he had people trained to find anything. A quiet message on his screen, a file attached, simple, efficient, complete. He stared at it for a moment before opening it, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness that whatever he found might change the way he understood everything that had happened the night before. The file opened. Lines of text, employment history, education, gaps, inconsistencies. But not the kind that suggested weakness, the kind that suggested something had been left out on purpose. Columbia University, economics and applied mathematics, top of her class, internships at firms he knew well, Firms that did not let talent like that slip away without reason. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his focus sharpening. This was not a coincidence. This was a pattern interrupted. He scrolled further. A position at a mid-level investment group. Short term. Then nothing. A clean break. No explanation, no transition, just silence. He sat back slowly, exhaling. The pieces were there, but they did not form a complete picture. Not yet. And that bothered him. Not because he needed control, but because for the first time, he recognized that understanding someone like her required more than data. Across the city, Clara moved through her shift as she always did. The rhythm unchanged. Orders, conversations, small moments of connection that passed unnoticed by most, but not by her. She observed everything, not out of habit, but out of instinct. The way people spoke when they thought no one was listening. The way decisions were made in fragments of conversation. The way assumptions shaped outcomes long before numbers ever confirmed them. During a quiet moment between tables, she stepped into the back hallway, reaching into her apron pocket again, this time pulling out the card. She looked at it briefly. The name, the number, clean, direct, intentional. She turned it slightly between her fingers, not considering what it could give her, but what it would require. Back in his office, Ethan closed the file, not satisfied, but certain of one thing. She had chosen to step away from something most people would spend their lives chasing, and that choice carried weight, more than any resume ever could. He stood up, walking toward the window, the city moving below him in precise, predictable patterns, but his mind was somewhere else, on a decision that could not be modeled, could not be calculated, because it did not belong to him. He reached for his phone again, then stopped, lowering his hand, recognizing the difference between pursuit and pressure. If he wanted her attention, it would not come from knowing more about her. It would come from becoming someone she chose to engage with. The realization settled in quietly, but firmly. Across town, Clara slipped the card back into her pocket, her expression unchanged, but her decision forming, not rushed, not influenced, just clear. She returned to the dining room, picking up her tray, stepping back into the flow of the evening. But something had shifted, not in her circumstances, but in the possibility of what could come next, not because someone had offered it, but because she had seen how it was offered, without force, without assumption, just an invitation. And as both of them moved through their separate worlds, one with everything, the other with almost nothing visible, the space between them was no longer defined by status, but by something far more difficult to navigate: choice. The decision did not come with a dramatic moment. No sudden call, no impulsive move, just a quiet shift that settled into Clara's mind as naturally as her next step across the dining floor. She finished her shift later than usual, the restaurant dimming into soft light and low conversation, chairs being reset, glasses polished, the familiar closing routine wrapping around her like a rhythm she had long memorized. But tonight, something followed her out into the cool night air, not pressure, not expectation, just a question that had not been there before. She walked a few blocks before stopping beneath a streetlight, the city quieter now, her reflection faint in the glass of a closed storefront. She reached into her apron, pulling out the card again, turning it between her fingers, not admiring it, not rejecting it, just acknowledging what it represented. Not a job, not an escape, but a change. And Clara understood change better than most people. She knew what it cost. She knew what it required. Back in his office, Ethan sat alone long after everyone else had left, the city outside now darker, quieter, but his office still lit, not out of necessity, but intention. He had not opened another file, had not taken another meeting, had not returned to the endless flow of decisions that usually filled his nights. Instead, he sat with something unfamiliar: patience, not the kind that waits for results, but the kind that allows space. His phone remained on the desk, untouched, not because he forgot, but because he chose not to reach for it. Across the city, Clara looked down at the card one more time, then made her decision, not quickly, not emotionally, but clearly. She slid the card into her coat pocket instead of her apron. A small shift, almost invisible, but meaningful. She began walking again, her steps steady, her expression unchanged, but her direction no longer entirely the same. The next morning arrived with the same quiet consistency, sunlight stretching across glass and steel, The city waking in emotion, Ethan arrived at his office earlier than usual, not because he had more to do, but because he had chosen to be there. He set his jacket aside, poured himself a cup of coffee, and for the first time in years, he did not open his schedule first. Instead, he sat down and waited, not for a call, not for confirmation, just for whatever came next. And somewhere across the city, Clara stood outside a building she had not entered in years, tall, familiar, distant in a way that only places tied to old decisions could feel. She looked up at it for a moment, then down at her phone, her thumb hovering briefly before pressing a single number. The line rang once, twice, and then connected. Ethan's phone lit up on the desk, the screen simple. One incoming call, no name, just a number he did not recognize. But something in him already knew. He picked it up without hesitation. "Ethan Cole," he said, his voice calm, but different now. Not guarded, not distant, just present. There was a brief pause on the other end. Not uncertainty, just space. Then Clara's voice, steady as ever. "You said you were willing to learn," she said. And in that moment, the distance between their worlds did not disappear, but it changed, no longer defined by assumption, but by choice. "I am," Ethan replied without hesitation, not as a reflex, but as a decision already made before the call even came. There was a brief silence on the line, not awkward, not uncertain, just measured. Clara did not rush her next words. "Then do not offer me a position," she said calmly. And for a moment, anyone else might have mistaken that for rejection, but Ethan did not interrupt. He listened, fully. "Offer me a problem," she continued, her tone steady, precise, "something your board cannot solve, something that does not respond to titles or assumptions." Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his grip on the phone relaxed, but his focus sharper than ever. "And if you solve it?" he asked, not testing, but clarifying. Clara answered without pause. "Then we talk again." The simplicity of it carried more weight than any contract could. Ethan allowed a small breath to leave him, not relief, but recognition. This was not about hiring. This was about proving alignment. "You already solved one," he said, but Clara's response came just as evenly. "No," she said. "I corrected what you were willing to show me." The distinction settled in immediately, precise, undeniable. Ethan nodded to himself, understanding that what she was asking for was not validation, but truth. "Give me 24 hours, he said, his tone calm, but firm. Clara did not agree right away, but she did not refuse either. "I will answer if it is worth answering," she replied, and then the line went quiet, not abruptly, just complete. Ethan lowered the phone slowly, placing it on the desk, his reflection faint in the glass behind it. But something about that reflection had shifted, not in appearance, but in awareness. He stood up, moving toward the window, the city unfolding beneath him in patterns he had spent years mastering. But now he was searching for something outside of patterns, something that required more than calculation. He turned back toward his desk, his mind already moving, not toward profit, not toward risk, but toward complexity, the kind of problem that could not be solved by authority, only by understanding. Across the city, Clara ended the call and slipped her phone back into her pocket, her expression unchanged, but her direction clearer. She stepped away from the building behind her, not entering it. Not yet, because this was not about returning to what she had left. It was about deciding what was worth stepping into next. She walked forward, her pace steady, her thoughts quiet, not anticipating, not doubting, just waiting. And back in his office, Ethan reached for a blank page, not a report, not a projection, just a space to think without structure. And for the first time in years, he did not begin with numbers. He began with a question, one that could not be answered by data alone, one that required him to see beyond what he had always trusted. And as he wrote it down, slowly, deliberately, he understood something that had taken him years to miss, that the most valuable problems are not the ones you can solve, but the ones that force you to become someone different in order to understand them. 24 hours passed without interruption, not because nothing happened, but because everything that mattered was happening beneath the surface. Ethan stood in the same office, the same city stretching endlessly below him, but the page on his desk was no longer blank. It held a single problem, not dressed in projections or forecasts, but stripped down to its core, a real scenario. One his company had struggled with quietly for months, a failing expansion in a market that refused to respond the way every model predicted. No clear reason, no obvious correction, just resistance, the kind that could not be forced, only understood. He looked at it one last time, then reached for his phone, dialing the number that had appeared just once and stayed with him since. Across the city, Clara answered on the second ring. Not rushed, not delayed, exactly on time. I have something, Ethan said, his voice steady, but carrying something new. Not authority, not urgency, but respect for what this moment required. There was no response from her immediately, just quiet attention. We expanded into a regional infrastructure market 18 months ago, he continued. The capital was deployed correctly. The projections were conservative, but adoption stalled, not declined, just stopped growing. He paused, not to think, but to allow space. We adjusted pricing, strategy, partnerships. Nothing changed the trajectory. Another pause, softer this time. The numbers say we should be succeeding, but reality is not following the model. Silence followed, but it was not empty. It was processing. Clara did not interrupt, did not ask questions right away. She let the shape of the problem form completely. Then she spoke. Send me the entry timeline, not the summary, the actual sequence of decisions. Her tone calm, precise. Ethan nodded. Already moving, forwarding the data without delay, no filtering, no adjustment, just truth. Minutes passed. Not many, but enough for something real to take shape. Ethan did not speak again. He waited, not because he had to, but because he chose to, and then her voice returned, unchanged, steady. You did not fail in strategy, she said. You failed in listening. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in resistance, but in focus. Explain, he said quietly. Clara continued. Your model assumes the market adapts to your timeline, but infrastructure does not respond to intention. It responds to trust, and trust does not follow capital. It follows presence. She paused, letting the distinction settle. You entered with efficiency, not with patience, so the system did not reject you. It simply waited you out. The words landed with quiet precision. Ethan turned slightly toward the window. The city no longer just a landscape, but a pattern he was beginning to see differently. So what changes? He asked, not challenging, but ready. Clara answered without hesitation. You stop trying to accelerate growth, and you start investing in understanding behavior. Smaller commitments, longer observation, fewer assumptions, she added. You do not scale what you have not earned yet. The silence that followed was different from the night before, not heavy, not shocked, but clear, as if something had just aligned beneath the surface. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in exhaustion, but in recognition. When he opened them again, the problem was no longer abstract. It was human, and that changed everything. That is not in any report, he said quietly. Clara's voice remained calm, almost distant. That is because reports measure outcomes, not relationships, she replied. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the answer had already been given. And as Ethan stood there, the city moving beneath him, he understood something that no boardroom had ever taught him, that the difference between control and understanding is the difference between being followed and being trusted. And on the other end of the line, Clara waited, not for approval, not for validation, but for the only thing that mattered now, whether he had truly listened.